But let me first commend the soldiers who responded when attacked by armed Venezuelans. I would not say sindicatos, armed Venezuelans in the Cuyuni River. So, I sympathize with their injuries and wish them a speedy recovery. But they were defending Guyana, notwithstanding the resources that they have available to them. It is important to set the context, as you mentioned, that Guyana has been occupied by Venezuela, part of Guyana, since 1966. Venezuela has continuously been in violation of international law, has continued violated Guyana's territorial integrity, attacked Guyana's sovereignty since 1966, the birthing of the nation state of Guyana. The Guyana Defense Force, and within the construct of the defense of Guyana, the model has always been diplomacy force, but with an ability of the defense force to defend Guyana. And that defense of Guyana is limited to the resources it has available at the time. But even as I say that, defending Guyana is time-bound. And for how long will you be able to hold the enemy until international relations, international effort, international condemnation, and stretching it far, troops come in to assist you. And that is where we are at the moment. I believe it's important for us to recognize that it is incumbent that the defense force at this point in time is re-equipped and better equipped to hold Venezuela for a determined piece of time, maybe 72 hours, until international pressure comes in. So diplomacy, yes, will still be an active weapon by Guyana, but we cannot forget the importance of building up those resources of the Guyana Defense Force to defend Guyana. A second point is important also, is that Article 33 of the Guyana Constitution speaks to, it is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. It's not only the Guyana Defense Force. So we still need to ensure at the level of the nation state, led by the government, that every Guyanese recognize that he or she has a duty to defend the state. And it's a very important duty. It's a duty that falls upon you once you birthed in this country. I am not sure where the Guyanese are at the moment, but I tend to believe that they're thinking that there are allies or friendly nations that will come to Guyana's aid, and they will solve our problem. They will solve this Venezuela issue. I have my doubts with that, and I say why. The extent to which they will come. In international politics, there are no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests. The price of peace to Guyana is what I'm concerned about. What are we going to pay for this peace that we want? What's the price? We thought Argyle was the price, the declaration, which we'll come back to later. So which country will send troops to Guyana? For example, I'm answering the question of diplomacy. Which country will send troops to Guyana if Guyana is not committed and committing its own resources to this effort? So the price could be very high if it's another nation coming to assist Guyana, where Guyana is providing at least limited or not significant contribution to its own defense. And it's important. And the reason why I mentioned this because we go back to the 80s and the 90s, the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, when we did spend a considerable amount of our budget on defense, but it kept Venezuela at bay. There was a lot of criticism with the budget expenditures to the defense force, but it kept Venezuela at bay. Have less spending percentage-wise on the defense of Guyana. If we were to cut infrastructure budget by 60% or 40%, it would not affect the other sectors. You have more money available to put towards defense. Again, I'm still dealing with the question of diplomacy. Is diplomacy sufficient? I think diplomacy needs to be buttressed with a total national defense effort in Guyana, what we call defense in depth, linked to living frontiers, living borders, linked to ensuring that the persons who are in the Venezuelans in Guyana are not forward elements or forward agents of the Maduro regime. We have a country that is actively engaging to take 2/3 of Guyana. And for us to believe that the Venezuelans in Guyana are all refugees, I think that's foolhardy. No doubt, in my mind, they are forward elements from Venezuela in Guyana, actively working to destabilize the Guyanese economy, the Guyanese society for the benefit of President Maduro. The Venezuelans are wargaming also what is happening. You can see it is calculated. They tested us on land, now they're testing us at sea, and the next test will be by air. So I say the government has a duty and responsibility now to think this thing carefully, look at the political calculus, look at the military calculus. We have sufficient experts in Guyana from both sides of the divide, so to speak, that can sit with the government and come up with a comprehensive plan. We have to bring in both political experts, military experts to deal with this issue. So diplomacy may not be enough in this point in time, save and except it's buttressed by strong defense action, increased military capability, regional cooperation within the construct of what is happening right now by Venezuela.
Between 2000, I believe, 8 and 10, I don't know if I have the dates, the period correct, but there was some saber rattling from Venezuela. 2 pontoons were blown up by Venezuela in Guyana's territory. I believe you were active in the military at that time. There was only a diplomatic reach that was used at that stage. There was absolutely no military reaction as far as I am aware. And while diplomacy was being employed in that area, there were multiple flyovers with F-16 fighters, particularly in the northwestern region of Guyana. A show of military might. I believe it was at around the same time when Venezuela started to manufacture high-powered assault rifles on, I believe, on franchise from Russia. And at that time, they had recently received some F-16 fighter jets, also from the same source, I believe it was. So I believe there was already this test with the flyovers, which I suspect, like you pointed out, could re-emerge. Dr. Best, Guyana is region 1 specifically, from the information I've received, seemed to have been settled within recent times by a larger number of Venezuelan immigrants than Guyanese residents. Appear to be in a build-up to what is calculated to be a quote-unquote election for a governor in Esequibo by Venezuela. Is this what is considered a soft invasion? And I ask that question against the background of the known fact that there's compulsory military service for particularly males in Venezuela, age 18 and above, save and except maybe you're the only child of the family and justifiably be exempted. So what it means is that a large percentage of the Venezuelans, maybe ruling out Warros, are either ex or current military service personnel, who are those in Guyana.
We also suggested, if you recall, that we have a limited amnesty within the Venezuelan community and therefore bring them under some regularization by the government so we know exactly who, again, discriminating positively, who really are refugees and who are not refugees. Because against the backdrop of Venezuela's continued aggression for over 3 decades, it is incumbent to understand and recognize that within the population from Venezuela, you must have elements who are not here really for the benefit of Guyana. And I think that is a big miss on the part of the government, in that we have not taken the opportunity to separate from the Venezuelan population here, those who are bona fide refugees, and those who are criminal elements, and those who are from gangs, and those who represent other parts of society that we don't really want in Guyana. So we've missed that opportunity. The opportunity can return, but we've missed that. The elections in Esequibo is a clear and present danger to Guyana's sovereignty. I believe the government needs to actively engage its intelligence resources within the region. The government ought to be saying clearly to the nation that any effort by any Guyanese or Venezuelan in Esequibo to conduct any elections is a clear and present threat to the laws of Guyana, and those persons will be prosecuted by law. We need to make very public statements when it comes to the issue of what is likely to happen in Esequibo, but not in Esequibo because it's being done in Venezuela, but it's linked to Esequibo. We have to ensure that the Venezuelans and Guyanese, perhaps, are not engaged in any act that is really a treason to the laws of Guyana. The other important thing to recognize is that the same elements that we use in foreign affairs, inviolability of borders, among other things, are set in the Guyana Constitution. So Venezuela, by its own actions, violate the articles and tenets of Guyana's Constitution by its own actions. And I said I will come back to the Argyle declaration again. A declaration is much weaker than an agreement. The ability, this notion of comparing Argyle declaration with the Geneva Agreement, right? It's a mismatch. We know that Venezuela always wanted a bilateral solution to this, to the controversy that it created. Not a controversy that was created by Guyana. It always wanted a bilateral approach. It was denied that bilateral approach by Geneva Agreement. And that took us to the ICJ. And post-ICJ, the government found it necessary to create a bilateral relationship with Venezuela, which is the Argyle Agreement. So we moved from the ICJ back to the Argyle Agreement because Venezuela was arguing and still trying to argue that it's best for Guyana and Venezuela to solve the problem. But we are in the ICJ. We have provisional measures against Venezuela from the ICJ. We have condemnation, reversely speaking, from the ICJ in relation to Venezuela. We have the Argyle Declaration, which is a very weak document. And now Venezuela's recent action by invading Guyana's EEZ technically has kicked Argyle Declaration out of the equation. There's no Argyle Declaration any longer because Venezuela has violated.
As well. It's
right?
kicked Geneva.
Well, Geneva, I wouldn't say Geneva is kicked. Geneva evolved into the ICJ process. So the Geneva still, it's the bed upon which the ICJ now rests.
We recognize
but
that.
I wouldn't say it is being quick. But I gotta say it's out.
Because of the particular clause that the UN Secretary General acted upon. I said what I said in the context of Venezuela's position, that the only solution is bilateral.
Oh.
And they kicked that in the sense that they have violated their own position that bilaterals could solve this by resorting to military aggression.
Within the construct of the provisional orders of the ICJ. I see it's important for us now to look at the ICJ process and Venezuela's conduct. And I would say forget Argyle. I would say look at the ICJ provisional orders. Those are binding on the nation states. Argyle Declaration is not binding on Guyana. The president is not bound by Argyle Declaration. Neither is Venezuela. It's an expression of goodwill between two gentlemen. The provisional orders, those are the orders that are important to Guyana. That is what is in the international sphere. You're going to find that the United States and other countries who come as allies will refer to the provisional orders of the ICJ.
And our budget. 55% of our more than $1 trillion budget goes to public infrastructure. A very small percentage to national defense. Venezuela, on the other hand, went to their parliament with a petition for a budget for what they call the development of La Guyana Esequibo. A budget that allowed for military assets to be deployed on Guyana's side, in Guyana's territory, at Ankoko, to be deployed on the western side of the border in the vicinity of San Martin and adjoining areas, for the deployment of a naval vessel just yesterday in Guyana's waters. Guyana focuses more than half of its national budget, 2 years running, on public infrastructure. We clearly have our priorities mixed up here, Dr. Bess. And I'm going to get political here, and you'll forgive me. But Guyana has focused, the People's Progressive Party government has focused on weaponizing the Guyana police force against citizens of this country that do not support the People's Progressive Party, and seem to have deliberately embarked on a venture to under-resource the Guyana Defense Force. How, therefore, in the face of the current evil that we confront, can we emerge from where we are?
Well, those are unfortunate realities that you mentioned, and as you said, you're very political. I mean, it's obvious to me, and this is a political construct we're in right now, it's obvious to me that we need a different government that is going to be better for the people. We need a government that is going to focus on defense. If you have to defend and secure what you have in a nation state, you cannot enjoy it if you can't defend it. And that's why I mentioned we'll come back to the sindicatos again. Earlier, I said that I'll come back to them. How is it possible for sindicatos to operate in the Cuyuna River where there's a substantive Venezuelan military presence? Why would a gang fire on a military force of another country? Those don't add up. In my view, those are forward elements of Venezuela. That was just testing the response of the Guyana Defense Force. How will we respond? How long it will take for us to respond? They're testing us. That's what they're doing. So, coming back to your question, politically speaking, the government needs to look at having a defense budget to develop and defend Esequibo. We're looking at having resources for Esequibo, both human resources and other types of resources in Esequibo for Esequibo to be safe. Guyana is not going to be safe if Esequibo is not safe. Esequibo has to be safe. And mind you, Coco Island is in the Cuyuna River, but it's part of the Esequibo. So Venezuela took its first stab at Esequibo since 1966. And we almost forget. And that's why in every conversation I have, I say, let's start with Venezuela occupying the half of Guyana's territory in Coco Island. We have to start there to remind people that Venezuela has been doing this since 1966. And under President Maduro, they've ramped up everything. We have the decrees claiming the EEZ, claiming territory. Now, what is happening now, and this is a breath of fresh air notwithstanding, the statements coming out of United States State Department and the Organization of American States condemnation, those are breath of fresh air indeed. I'm not going to discount that. Not at all. The president spoke to the nation, that was expected. Touched on some important areas, that was expected. But I would like to add that Guyana is a member of the United Nations Security Council. I thought in the public space, the government would have spoken about that. What action we will take within the Security Council, what allies have we formed, alliances within the Security Council to bring this matter to the Security Council and get a condemnation by the UN Security Council of Venezuelan action. It's not going to be easy because you have the permanent five in the Security Council who have the vetoes: Russia, United States, France,
Whitewater, Camwater, Yarakita, across a creek, Kaikan, across a river, Parima, close to the Tri-Junction, Charity, just across the Atlantic into the mouth of the Pomeroon River from Venezuela. These, well, of course, Iteringbang and so on, we know very, very close to the border. A lot of indigenous peoples reside in villages on lands that they own. Historically, the indigenous population on the frontier were Guyana's eyes and ears. There were mechanisms put in place for the relay of information from the frontier to the center. And the Guyana Defense Force has always been on top of such communication over the years. It is apparent that if it exists still, it may have waned a bit, or significantly for that matter. But there's a bigger problem. You see, before the states were formed in South America, before state lines were drawn, there were indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples do not regard territorial borders the way others do, and will migrate across rivers and across lines at will. In fact, there are villages on the Guyana side whose elected leaders are closely related to the elected leaders of villages on the Venezuelan side. And so when it comes to potential armed conflict, when it comes to the exercise of aggression by our Western neighbors, it affects the indigenous peoples in a very significant way. It has a psychological impact on indigenous peoples, both sides of the border. Because if there's to be conflict, it'll be families against families. And if there are to be retreats for safety, for places of sanctuary, it could cause problems, because sanctuary for some on the western side of the border could be over this side. And there are potential difficult circumstances that can emerge. We are not hearing about interaction at the governmental level with our indigenous communities to bring some kind of comfort to them, to bring some kind of awareness to them about what's happening. I know that there have been times in the past when officers of the Guyana Defense Force will engage villages and bring them up to scratch with information. I myself, between 2015 and 2020, have been involved in arranging such discourses. Do you get a sense that there is a disregard for the indigenous frontier populations? And if you do you sense that there are some consequences that we may regret?
I believe that there's maybe a de-emphasis on the importance of the indigenous populations. When it comes to the Guyana Defense Force, I feel confident that the mechanism that was set up over the decades of information gathering and transmission, I think that continues with the GDF. I don't think they're short from that responsibility. But we're moving in a fast-paced world. We're going to in a world of AI now, artificial intelligence. So the point I'm making is that the resources have to be upgraded significantly to deal with the new information threat that is out there, the new type of warfare that will be waged, propaganda warfare, other types of warfare. So I think the information infrastructure is there. In relation to the government and its duty to the frontier populations, I think, yes, you have a point there, because you need to have government officials along with civil society going into these frontier areas and speak to them continuously on what is happening. To them, in my view, the frontier population is not what diplomatic efforts the government is taking. To them is what efforts you're taking to make me feel more safe in my community. We have to come back to defense, because we have to defend the nation, and by defending the nation, you have to defend the people. So in those communities, they must feel that there's some defense mechanism to which they can turn. And that is within their own villages, because years ago, they were all part of a notion of a reserve, that they reserve limited training, how they'll defend the communities. And then you have the defense force of itself. That way you have people much more experienced that will be there to protect you. Those are the kind of defense we're talking about. Not only having contact with a Venezuelan enemy that comes over, but providing defense architecture and mechanisms to our villages and villagers, so they feel comfortable that if something should happen, then the defense forces there to assist them with that defense. That is all part of defense, and that is part of the total national defense that I spoke about, which involves all resources, all human and material resources within the nation state, within a community, a village, a region, and a country. And that is a concept that has been out there for decades, and the government can begin to operationalize that concept. And in doing that, we provide a better line of defense for frontier communities. And if our frontier communities are strong and we have good defense there, then the internal communities will be strong.
Back in time, 1969, when the communication devices were not available, the ones we have today, when the technology was way if you were to assess them now, you might say
archaic.
More than archaic, because those were the days of telegraphs and so on.
Yes.
back then, the intelligence structure, when it comes to the frontiers and the relationship of the defense force with the frontier residents, effectively served to assist in a major way in playing down Venezuela's aggression in '69 when there was the Rupununi uprising, which was, I believe, motivated and funded and directed by the Venezuelan military. This is the information I've been picking up. I don't know. I've not done sufficient reading on it. Where the two families essentially in the Rupununi wanted to separate the part of the Esequibo from Guyana. And it seems to me from the little reading that I've done that it was Venezuelan inspired and it was part of their plan to seize some of our territory. Talk to us a little bit about that, if you will, please, Dr. Best, and in the context of what's happening now.
It is good that we're dealing with it contextually because we had the Rupununi uprising, as you quite rightly mentioned, was about ceding part of Guyana territory to Venezuela, albeit inspired by Guyanese families with strong links to Venezuela. And that was happening during a period, the continuous period of Venezuela's claim to 2/3 of Guyana. I don't think why we should think differently now. Venezuela continues to make this claim against Guyana. And now Venezuela is still claiming Esequibo. And I go back to the point I make, that at the level of the security infrastructure in the state, we have to be interrogating every move by Venezuela in Venezuela, and by extension, Venezuelan migrants or Venezuelan nationals in Guyana. We have to know whether or not they're communicating with Guyanese families. We have to know whether or not they're putting Guyanese families under pressure. We have to know whether or not we have another set of people who may want to declare parts of Esequibo to be part of Venezuela. This is a move that is being championed by the Venezuelan government. They're going to hold elections. We have to be prepared to act if a group of persons in Esequibo say, we recognize these elections. The government of Ghana has to be prepared immediately, as I said earlier, to have them arrested and prosecuted. And let me make this point. Ghana has always maintained the integrity of its borders, albeit in the 80s and 90s more intensely than now. We have evidence of the Coast Guard arresting Venezuelan vessels. I was the head of the Coast Guard at one time. I was a patrol commander of a vessel at one time. We did these patrols. We arrested Venezuelan vessels from illegally fishing in Guyana and prosecuted them in the courts of Guyana, that we never abandoned the borders of this country. So the government has to view the defense force as a critical element in its policy for diplomacy. It has to see it in that light. Because in any nation state, because when we talk about allies coming to assist us, we're talking about the defense forces of allied nations coming to assist us, not the civilian population. So the Ghana Defense Force is a critical organ of government in this country. And it has to be given the resources required to ensure that it can provide the necessary services to every Guyanese. Because it's important, and that's why we cannot see the Defense Force just as, okay, Defense Force is a critical organization in this country. Very, very critical. Because it's important, and that's why we cannot see the Defense Force just as, okay, Defense Force is a critical organization in this country. Very, very critical. So we have to, given the circumstances, the current circumstances, where Venezuela is claiming 2/3 of Guyana, we have to be very, very careful about the Venezuelans who are in Guyana. We have a gentleman who's claiming 2/3 of Guyana. We have many Venezuelans in Guyana. We don't know their status. So naturally, we have to be careful and concerned about the Venezuelans. Naturally, you have to find out within that population. Government should be led to determine who refugees from who not refugees, who bona fide economic refugees. And that is something that we have not done as a nation. So I would say defense and diplomacy, those are the two areas I think we need to focus on. Defense and diplomacy, and defense is wide enough to include the hinterland, include the frontiers, include upgrading the equipment in the Guyana Defense Force. And diplomacy, when we come to diplomacy, we're talking about Guyana maximizing its presence at the UN Security Council. We're talking about the ambassadors becoming more present, more visible in the capitals. We're also talking about having permanent representation in the African Union, because you're talking about, I think, almost 53 states in that country. The African Union, that's a good place to be. You have good international cooperation among those countries. So we can expand our diplomatic reach beyond this current infrastructure to continents like Africa. We have relations with India, we have with China, but with the other Asian countries that had serious conflict in the country, like Vietnam and Thailand, and we can also learn from those countries, including other nation states. So I think we need to expand our diplomatic effort significantly and be in those capitals. Defense and diplomacy has a cost. They cost money. We've got better financial resources now. We need to put a fence around the yard we live in. We need to put a secure fence around the country we live in. No matter how we develop, if we don't put a secure fence to secure our nation state, we're going to have serious problems of breaching.